In the fog-choked village of St. Mary Mead, a sinister stranger named Reno unleashes a wave of gruesome murders, his eerie symbols and hypnotic eyes hinting at an ancient evil. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, and Miss Marple unite to unravel his chilling harvest, facing spectral forces and a ritual that threatens to awaken the old ones. Will they stop Reno before the village becomes a graveyard, or become his final offering? The fog clung to Baker Street like a shroud, thick and suffocating, as if London itself were holding its breath. It was late October, and the air carried a damp chill that seeped into bones and lingered like an unwelcome guest. Sherlock Holmes sat by the fire in his cluttered rooms at 221B, his violin resting on his knee, though he hadn't played a note in hours. His sharp eyes, usually alight with restless energy, were fixed on the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing, swirling in ghostly patterns. Dr. John Watson, seated across from him, turned the pages of the Times with a sigh, the rustle of paper the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. "Really, Holmes," Watson said at last, folding the newspaper with a touch of exasperation, "you've been staring at that fog for hours. If you're waiting for a case to materialize out of it, you might at least share your thoughts." Holmes's lips twitched, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Patience, Watson. The fog conceals as much as it reveals. Something is coming. I can feel it in the air, a disturbance, a ripple in the ordinary." Watson snorted, accustomed to Holmes's cryptic pronouncements. "You sound like a fortune teller. Next you'll be reading tea leaves." Before Holmes could retort, a sharp knock echoed through the room, startling them both. It wasn't the polite rap of Mrs. Hudson or the timid tap of a client. This was urgent, insistent, almost frantic. Holmes's eyes gleamed and he set the violin aside, his posture shifting from languor to alertness in an instant. "Come in," he called, his voice steady but laced with anticipation. The door creaked open, revealing a figure shrouded in a heavy cloak, the hood pulled low against the fog's damp embrace. The stranger hesitated, then stepped inside, bringing with them a faint scent of wet wool and something sharper, something metallic, like blood. Watson's hand instinctively moved toward the revolver he kept in the drawer, but Holmes's subtle gesture stayed him. "Mr. Holmes?" The voice was soft, feminine, and trembling, but it carried a resolve that belied its fragility. The figure pushed back the hood, revealing a woman of advanced years, her white hair neatly pinned, her eyes sharp despite the lines etched around them. She was no ordinary client, Watson realized at once. There was a quiet dignity about her, a strength that seemed at odds with her delicate frame. "I am Miss Jane Marple," she said, her gaze flicking between Holmes and Watson. "I've come from St. Mary Mead on a matter of utmost urgency. I fear it is a case beyond my own abilities, though I am not unaccustomed to solving mysteries." Holmes's brow arched, and Watson caught the glint of curiosity in his friend's eyes. "Miss Marple," Holmes said, rising and gesturing to a chair, "your reputation precedes you. The amateur sleuth of St. Mary Mead, whose knack for unraveling village intrigues rivals the best of Scotland Yard. Please sit. Tell me what brings you to London through such a perilous fog." Miss Marple settled into the chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her fingers twitched, betraying her unease. "It is not a village matter this time, Mr. Holmes. It is something far darker, far more sinister. I hesitate to call it supernatural, for I am a practical woman, but—" She paused, her eyes darting to the window as if expecting something to emerge from the fog. "I believe we are dealing with a horror that defies reason." Watson leaned forward, his skepticism warring with the chill creeping up his spine. "A horror? What exactly do you mean, Miss Marple?" She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "It began 3 weeks ago, in St. Mary Mead. A young man arrived in the village, a stranger who called himself Reno. No surname, no history, just Reno. He took lodgings at the Blue Boar Inn, kept to himself, but there was something about him, something that set everyone on edge. His eyes, Mr. Holmes, they were wrong. Too bright, too knowing, as if they saw things no one else could." Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression unreadable. "Describe him further." "Tall, thin, almost gaunt," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "Pale as death, with hair so black it seemed to swallow the light. He wore a long coat, always buttoned to the chin, and he carried a silver cane with a strange carving on the handle, a serpent coiled around a skull. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was soft, almost hypnotic. The villagers avoided him, though none could say why. It was as if he carried a shadow that wasn't his own." Watson frowned. "Sounds like a peculiar fellow, but hardly a horror." "Perhaps he's just eccentric." Miss Marple's eyes hardened. "Eccentric men do not leave bodies in their wake, Dr. Watson." The room seemed to grow colder, the fire's warmth retreating. Holmes leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Bodies? 3. So far," Miss Marple said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The first was Old Man Granger, found in his cottage with his throat torn out, as if by an animal. The second was Mary Dobbs, a maid at the vicarage, her body drained of blood, her face frozen in terror. The third was a child, little Tommy Weaver, barely 10 years old. He was found in the churchyard, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing, with no mark on him but a single puncture at his neck." Watson's stomach churned and he glanced at Holmes, expecting skepticism. But Holmes's face was grim, his mind already racing. "And you believe this Reno is responsible?" Holmes asked. "I cannot prove it," Miss Marple admitted, "but he was seen near each victim before they died. The villagers whisper of curses, of demons, but I do not believe such things. Yet there is something unnatural about him, Mr. Holmes, something that makes my skin crawl, and I have seen many dark things in my time." Holmes rose, pacing to the window, his silhouette stark against the swirling fog. "Why come to me, Miss Marple? You've solved murders before. What makes this case different?" She hesitated, her hands tightening in her lap. "Because I saw him last night in the fog, outside my own cottage. He stood beneath the lamppost, staring up at my window, and when I looked into his eyes—" Her voice faltered and she swallowed hard. "I felt as if my soul were being pulled from my body. I cannot explain it, but I knew then that this was no ordinary man. I need your help, Mr. Holmes. I fear he will not stop until St. Mary Mead is a graveyard." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant toll of a church bell. Watson's heart pounded, though he tried to dismiss it as nerves. Holmes turned from the window, his eyes alight with a fire Watson knew all too well, the thrill of a challenge. "Very well, Miss Marple," Holmes said. "Holmes, we shall accompany you to St. Mary Mead at first light. But tell me, did Reno leave anything behind? Any clue, however small?" Miss Marple reached into her reticule and produced a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a silver coin, tarnished and etched with strange symbols that seemed to writhe in the firelight. "I found this in Tommy Weaver's hand," she said. It was clutched so tightly his fingers bled. Holmes took the coin, holding it up to the light. His expression darkened, and for the first time, Watson saw a flicker of unease in his friend's eyes. "This is no ordinary coin," Holmes murmured. "These symbols, they are ancient, older than any language I know. They speak of things best left undisturbed." Watson's unease deepened. "Holmes, what are you saying?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He pocketed the coin and turned to Miss Marple. "Rest here tonight. You'll be safe under Mrs. Hudson's roof. Tomorrow we go to St. Mary Mead. But be warned, Miss Marple. This Reno may be more than a man, and if he is what I suspect, we are walking into a darkness unlike any we have faced before." The fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows as if eager to listen. Watson shivered, the weight of Holmes's words settling over him like a pall. Miss Marple nodded, her face pale but resolute. The fire crackled, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, and in that moment Watson felt the first stirrings of a dread he could not name, a dread that would only grow as they followed the trail of the man called Reno. The train rattled through the early morning mist, its wheels clacking a relentless rhythm against the tracks as it carried Sherlock Holmes, Dr. John Watson, and Miss Jane Marple toward St. Mary Mead. The fog that had smothered London the previous night seemed to follow them, curling around the countryside like a predator stalking its prey. Inside their compartment, the air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the carriage or the distant whistle of the engine. Holmes sat by the window, his sharp profile etched against the gray haze, his fingers tracing the outline of the strange silver coin in his pocket. Watson, opposite him, clutched his medical bag, his eyes darting between Holmes and Miss Marple, who sat knitting with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural given the circumstances. The rhythmic click of her needles was maddening, yet Watson found it oddly grounding, a tether to normalcy in the face of the unknown. Miss Marple's eyes, however, betrayed her serene facade, sharp, watchful, scanning the compartment as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Watson cleared his throat, desperate to break the oppressive quiet. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice louder than intended in the confined space. "You mentioned Reno's effect on the villagers. Has anyone spoken to him directly? Tried to learn his intentions?" Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked up, her gaze piercing. "Oh yes, Dr. Watson. The vicar, Mr. Clements, tried. He's a brave soul, always eager to welcome strangers. To St. Mary Mead. He invited Reno to tea, thinking to draw him out. But Reno, he just smiled, that awful smile of his, and said something about the harvest being near. Mr. Clements hasn't slept properly since. Says he dreams of eyes watching him from the dark." Holmes's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. "The harvest? Did he elaborate?" "No," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. "But the way he said it, it wasn't about crops or seasons. It was as if he were speaking of souls. The vicar swore he felt a chill, like a door had opened to somewhere cold and empty." Watson shivered, though the compartment was warm. "Superstition, surely," he said, more to convince himself than anyone else. "The man's odd, perhaps dangerous. But this talk of harvests and souls, it's the stuff of ghost stories." Holmes's lips twitched into a grim smile. "Watson, you of all people should know that the truth often hides behind the guise of the impossible. This coin," he held up the tarnished silver disc, its strange symbols catching the dim light, "is no mere trinket. Its markings are not of any known script, neither Latin, Greek, nor even the runes of the Norsemen. They suggest something older, something other." Miss Marple's needles stopped again, and she leaned forward, her voice low. "Mr. Holmes, do you believe in the supernatural?" Holmes's gaze flicked to her, unreadable. "I believe in what can be observed, tested, and deduced. But I do not discount the possibility of forces beyond our current understanding. This Reno, if he is what I suspect, may be a key to such forces, or a pawn of them." The train lurched, and the compartment plunged into momentary darkness as they passed through a tunnel. Watson's heart leapt, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver in his coat. The light returned, revealing nothing amiss, but the unease lingered. Miss Marple's eyes were fixed on the window, where the fog seemed to press closer, as if trying to seep through the glass. "Holmes," Watson said, his voice tight, "what do you suspect Reno is?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He pocketed the coin and leaned back, his fingers steepled. "I suspect he is a predator, Watson, but not the kind we've faced before. The deaths in St. Mary Mead, throats torn, blood drained, a child unmarked. Save for a single puncture, suggest a pattern, a ritual. The coin, the symbols, his presence, and they point to something ancient, something that thrives on fear and death." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "The villagers feel it too. They lock their doors at night, hang garlic over their windows, though they won't say why. It's as if some primal instinct warns them of what's coming." The train slowed, its whistle piercing the fog as it approached St. Mary Mead's small station. The platform was deserted, the station house's windows dark, as if the village itself were holding its breath. As they disembarked, The fog seemed to thicken, swallowing the train's red tail lights until they were nothing but a faint glow. Watson pulled his coat tighter, the damp air carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded him unsettlingly of blood. Holmes led the way, his long strides purposeful, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Miss Marple followed, her small figure surprisingly spry, her knitting bag clutched like a shield. Watson brought up the rear, his senses heightened, every rustle in the fog making his pulse quicken. The village of St. Mary Mead was eerily silent, its cottages huddled together like frightened children. The Blue Boar Inn, where Reno was said to be staying, loomed at the edge of the village square, its sign creaking in the wind. The windows glowed faintly, but the light seemed wrong, too red, too unsteady, as if cast by something other than candles or lamps. As they approached, the inn's door swung open, and a man stepped out, his silhouette tall and thin against the flickering light. Watson's breath caught. The man's coat was long, buttoned to the chin, and in his hand he held a silver cane, its serpent and skull handle glinting. Reno. He turned, and even from a distance Watson felt the weight of his gaze. Those eyes, too bright, too knowing, seemed to pierce the fog, locking onto them with an intensity that made Watson's skin crawl. Miss Marple gasped softly, her hand tightening on her bag. Holmes, however, stepped forward, his expression calm, but his body coiled like a spring. "Mr. Reno, I presume," Holmes called, his voice cutting through the fog like a blade. Reno's lips curled into a smile, slow and predatory. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice soft, almost melodic, yet it carried a weight that made Watson's chest tighten, and, "Miss Marple, I've been expecting you." The words hung in the air, heavy with menace. Watson's hand hovered near his revolver, but Holmes's slight shake of the head stayed him. Reno's eyes flicked to Watson, and for a moment, Watson felt as if the world had tilted, as if he were falling into those endless, burning eyes. Then Reno turned, his cane tapping the ground, and disappeared into the inn, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Holmes exhaled, a rare sign of tension. "He knows we're here," he said quietly, "and he's not afraid. That makes him dangerous." Miss Marple's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. He looked at me as if he knew my every thought, my every fear. "Mr. Holmes, what is he?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He stared at the inn, his mind racing. "We'll find out soon enough," he said at last. "But first, we need to speak with the villagers, examine the bodies, and search Reno's room. If he's as clever as he seems, he'll have left us something. A clue, a taunt. This is no ordinary game, Watson. This is a hunt." The fog closed in around them, muffling their footsteps as they moved toward the inn. Watson's heart pounded, the memory of Reno's eyes burning in his mind. He had faced danger before, war, criminals, madmen. But this was different. This was a darkness that seemed to seep from the very air, a horror that whispered of things older than time. And as they stepped into the Blue Boar Inn, Watson couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the jaws of something ancient, something hungry, something that had been waiting for them all along. The interior of the Blue Boar Inn was a stark contrast to the oppressive fog outside, yet it offered no comfort. The air was thick with the scent of stale ale, wood smoke, and something acrid like burnt herbs. The common room was dimly lit, its low ceiling pressing down like a lid on a coffin. A few villagers huddled at tables, their faces pale and drawn, their whispers dying as Sherlock Holmes, Dr. John Watson, and Miss Jane Marple entered. The fire in the hearth sputtered, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The innkeeper, a stout man with a nervous tic, froze behind the counter, his eyes darting toward the staircase as if expecting something or someone to descend. Holmes's gaze swept the room, cataloging every detail. The uneven floorboards, the cracked mugs on the tables, the faint scratches on the wall near the stairs, as if something sharp had grazed them. He moved with purpose, his long coat trailing behind him like a shadow, and approached the innkeeper, who flinched under his scrutiny. "Good evening," Holmes said, his voice calm but edged with authority. "We require rooms for the night. And I wish to speak with you about your guest, Mr. Reno." The innkeeper's hands trembled as he wiped them on his apron. "Reno? He's upstairs, sir. Keeps to himself mostly. Don't cause no trouble, but—" His voice dropped to a whisper. "He ain't right, sir. Them eyes of his, they see too much." Miss Marple, standing quietly by Watson, tilted her head, her sharp eyes noting the innkeeper's fear. "Has he done anything specific to alarm you, Mr. Graves, ma'am, Tom Graves?" The innkeeper swallowed hard. "He don't eat, not proper food, leastways not that I've seen. And at night I hear things, footsteps, whispers like he's talking to someone, but there ain't no one there. Last week I found blood, sir, on the floor outside his room. Just a few drops, mind, but it weren't there before." Watson's stomach tightened, his mind flashing to Miss Marple's account of the murders. "Blood?" he asked, his voice low. "Did you report it?" Graves shook his head, his eyes wide. "Who'd believe me? The constable's scared witless, and the villagers, they're all locking their doors, praying he'll move on. But he don't. He stays, and folks keep dying." Holmes's expression remained impassive, but Watson knew that look. The gears of his mind were turning, piecing together fragments of a puzzle only he could see. "Show us to his room," Holmes said, "and bring the key." Graves hesitated, then nodded, fumbling for a ring of keys. As they followed him up the creaking stairs, Watson felt the weight of the villagers' stares, their fear palpable. Miss Marple's knitting bag swung gently at her side, but her fingers were still, her attention fixed on the shadows pooling at the edges of the lamplight. Reno's room was at the end of a narrow hallway, its door unremarkable, save for a faint symbol scratched into the wood, a serpent coiled around a skull, identical to the one on his cane. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he traced the mark with a gloved finger. "Deliberate," he murmured. "A warning, or perhaps an invitation." Graves unlocked the door, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the key. "I ain't going." "In, sir," he said, stepping back. "Not for all the gold in London." "Very well," Holmes said, pushing the door open. "Stay here, but do not leave." The room was Spartan, almost unnaturally so. A single bed, a washstand, a small table. No personal effects, no signs of habitation, except for a faint lingering scent of that same burnt herb odor. The window was shut tight, the curtains drawn, but the air felt heavy, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Watson's skin prickled, his instincts screaming that something was wrong, though he couldn't say what. Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room with the precision of a hawk. "He's careful," she said softly. "Too careful. No one lives this cleanly unless they're hiding something." Holmes nodded, moving to the table. He ran his fingers along its edge, then knelt, peering beneath it. "Indeed," he said, producing a small blackened vial from the floorboards. It was no larger than a thimble, sealed with wax, and etched with the same serpentine symbol. He held it to the light, revealing a viscous, dark liquid within. "Curious," he murmured. "Not blood, but something else." Watson peered over his shoulder, his medical curiosity piqued despite his unease. "Poison, perhaps." "Perhaps," Holmes said, pocketing the vial. "But I suspect it's something far older than any poison we know." As they searched the room, Miss Marple paused by the window, her fingers brushing the curtain. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice tight. "Look." She pulled the curtain aside, revealing the glass and the faint, greasy smear of a handprint. It was too large, too elongated, the fingers unnaturally thin, as if stretched beyond human proportions. Watson's breath caught, his rational mind grappling with the impossibility of it. "That's not human," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Holmes examined the print, his face unreadable. "Not entirely," he agreed. "But it's deliberate. He wants us to find these traces, to feel the weight of his presence." A sudden noise, a low, guttural hum, came from the hallway, freezing them in place. It was faint, almost inaudible, yet it seemed to vibrate in Watson's chest like the pulse of something vast and ancient. Graves whimpered, backing toward the stairs. "That's him," he whispered. He's back. Holmes's hand shot, silencing him. "Stay calm," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Watson, your revolver." Watson drew the weapon, his heart pounding as the humming grew louder, accompanied by the slow, deliberate tap of a cane. The shadows in the hallway seemed to deepen, the lamplight flickering as if struggling against an encroaching darkness. Miss Marple's hand tightened on her knitting bag, her lips moving silently, as if in prayer. Reno appeared at the end of the hallway, his tall, gaunt figure framed by the dim light. His coat seemed to absorb the shadows, and his eyes, those terrible, burning eyes, locked onto them with an intensity that made Watson's knees weaken. The humming stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. "Mr. Holmes," Reno said, his voice smooth and cold like a blade sliding across silk. "Miss Marple, Dr. Watson, you've been poking about in my affairs." Holmes stepped forward, unflinching. "And you've been leaving bodies in your wake. Mr. Reno, or should I say, something else?" Reno's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too white. "You're clever, Holmes, but cleverness won't save you from what's coming. The harvest is near, and you're already part of it." Before Holmes could respond, Reno raised his cane, the serpent and skull handle glinting. A low, resonant hum filled the air, and the room seemed to tilt, the walls pulsing as if alive. Watson's vision blurred, his revolver slipping from his grasp as a wave of dizziness overwhelmed him. Miss Marple gasped, clutching her chest while Holmes staggered, his hand gripping the table for support. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sensation stopped. Reno was gone, the hallway empty, the cane's tap fading into the distance. Watson's breath came in ragged gasps, his revolver lying uselessly at his feet. What was that?" he managed. Holmes straightened, his face pale but resolute. "A warning," he said, "and a demonstration. He's not just a man, Watson, he's something else." Miss Marple, still clutching her bag, looked shaken but determined. "We can't let him leave, Mr. Holmes. Whatever he is, he's dangerous, and he knows we're here." Holmes nodded, his eyes burning with a fierce determination. "Then we move quickly. We need to examine the bodies, speak to the vicar, and find out what Reno's harvest entails. But be warned, this is no ordinary foe. He's playing a game, and we're on his board." As they left the room, the fog outside seemed to pulse as if alive, its tendrils curling around the inn like fingers. Watson's heart raced, the memory of Reno's eyes and that unearthly hum haunting him. The village of St. Mary Mead was no longer just a quaint hamlet. It was a battleground, and the trio was walking deeper into a nightmare that threatened to consume them all. The fog hung over St. Mary Mead like a funeral veil, its gray tendrils weaving through the village's narrow lanes and clinging to the thatched roofs of its cottages. The air was heavy with the scent of damp, earth and decay, as if the ground itself were exhaling something ancient and malign. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. John Watson, and Miss Jane Marple stepped out of the Blue Boar Inn, their breath visible in the chill morning air. The encounter with Reno the previous night had left them shaken, but Holmes's resolve was unshaken, his eyes scanning the village with predatory focus. Watson clutched his revolver, its weight a small comfort against the creeping dread that had settled in his bones. Miss Marple, her knitting bag slung over her shoulder, walked with a quiet determination, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Their destination was the vicarage, where Miss Marple had arranged for them to meet the vicar, Mr. Clements, and examine the bodies of the victims which had been stored in the church's crypt pending a coroner's inquest. The village was unnaturally quiet, its streets deserted, the windows of every cottage shuttered tight. The only sound was the distant cawing of crows, their harsh cries echoing through the fog like a warning. As they approached the vicarage, a modest stone building beside the ancient church, Watson noticed the faint outlines of garlic wreaths hanging over doorways and windows. "Superstition seems to have taken hold," he remarked, trying to inject levity into his voice, though it came out strained. Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Not superstition, Dr. Watson. Instinct. The villagers may not understand what Reno is, but they feel the danger. I've seen it before. People clinging to old remedies when fear overtakes reason. Holmes paused at the churchyard gate, his gaze fixed on the weathered tombstones, half hidden in the fog. Fear is a powerful motivator, he said, his voice low. But it also clouds judgment. We must remain clear-headed, for Reno is counting on our fear to blind us. The vicarage door opened before they could knock, revealing Mr. Clements, a wiry man with a pale face and haunted eyes. His clerical collar hung loosely, as if he'd lost weight in recent weeks, and his hands trembled as he gestured them inside. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice cracking. "I prayed you'd come, but I never imagined you'd bring us such company." His eyes flicked to Holmes, a mix of awe and apprehension in his gaze. "Mr. Clements," Holmes said, his tone brisk, "but not unkind. We need to see the bodies, and I understand you spoke with Reno. Tell us everything." The vicar led them into a small parlor, its walls lined with books and religious icons that seemed to offer little comfort. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that made Watson's skin crawl. They sat, though Holmes remained standing, his restless energy filling the room. "Reno came to me 2 weeks ago," Clements began, his voice barely above a whisper. "He appeared at the church one evening just as I was locking up. He said he was a traveler seeking redemption. His words were polite, but his eyes—" The vicar shuddered. They were like staring into an abyss. "I invited him to tea, thinking to learn more, but he spoke in riddles, about a harvest that would cleanse the world, about vessels waiting to be filled. I felt wrong after he left, as if part of me had been taken." Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting needles clicking softly, though her hands moved with mechanical precision. "Did he leave anything behind, Mr. Clements? A token, perhaps, or a mark?" The vicar hesitated, then reached into his pocket, producing a small, folded piece of parchment. "This," he said, handing it to Holmes. "I found it in the church the next morning, tucked into the hymn book he'd been holding." Holmes unfolded the parchment, revealing a series of symbols identical to those on the silver coin and Reno's cane. Serpents coiling around skulls, interspersed with angular alien script. His eyes narrowed, and Watson caught a rare flicker of unease in his friend's expression. "These symbols again," Holmes murmured. "They're not merely decorative, they're a language, a code, or perhaps a summons." Watson frowned, peering over Holmes's shoulder. "A summons for what?" Holmes didn't answer, his attention fixed on the parchment. "Mr. Clements, the bodies. Where are they?" The vicar led them to the church, a squat, ancient structure, with a steeple that seemed to lean under the weight of the fog. The crypt was accessed through a heavy iron door behind the altar, its hinges groaning as Clements pushed it open. The air grew colder as they descended, the stone steps slick with damp. Watson's breath caught in his throat, the darkness below seeming to pulse with a life of its own. The crypt was a low, vaulted chamber, its walls lined with stone shelves where the dead of St. Mary Mead had rested for centuries. 3 bodies lay on wooden tables covered with sheets. The air was thick with the stench of decay, though something else lingered, a sharp, metallic tang that reminded Watson of Reno's presence at the inn. Holmes approached the first body, that of Old Man Granger, and pulled back the sheet. Watson stifled a gasp. The man's throat was torn open, the flesh ragged as if mauled by a beast, yet the wounds were oddly precise, almost surgical. Holmes's gloved fingers traced the edges, his expression unreadable. "Not an animal," he said. "The cuts are too deliberate, too intentional." Miss Marple, standing a few steps back, peered at the body, her face pale but composed. "Like a ritual," she said softly. "I've seen cruelty in my time, Mr. Holmes, but this feels like something else." Holmes moved to the second body, Mary Dobbs, the maid. Her skin was ashen, almost translucent, her veins visible beneath the surface like a map of rivers, drained dry. Her face was frozen in a rictus of terror, her eyes wide and staring. Holmes examined her neck, finding 2 small punctures, barely noticeable but unmistakable. "Drained," he said, his voice grim. "Yet there's no blood on the surrounding tissue. Whatever did this was efficient." Watson's stomach churned, his medical training warring with the horror before him. "Vampirism?" he said, half joking, though his voice trembled. "Surely you don't believe—" Holmes shot him a sharp look. "I believe in evidence, Watson, and the evidence suggests something beyond our current understanding. The third body, little Tommy Weaver, was the hardest to face. The boy lay still, his small frame dwarfed by the table, his face peaceful yet unnaturally pale. There were no visible wounds save for a single puncture at his neck, surrounded by a faint bruise that seemed to pulse in the dim light." Miss Marple's hand flew to her mouth, and Watson saw tears in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. "He was a bright boy," she said. "Always running through the village, laughing. To see him like this." Holmes's jaw tightened, a rare sign of emotion. He examined the boy's hand, still clutching the silver coin Miss Marple had given him. "The coin was a message," he said. "Reno wanted us to find it, to know he's watching." As they studied the bodies, a low hum filled the crypt, the same guttural sound they'd heard at the inn. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening, and Watson's heart pounded as he gripped his revolver. "He's here," he whispered, his eyes darting to the crypt's entrance. Holmes spun, his hand on his own weapon, but the doorway was empty. The hum grew louder, vibrating in their chests, and the candles flickered, casting wild shadows that seemed to twist into serpentine shapes. Miss Marple clutched her knitting bag, her lips moving in silent prayer, while Watson's vision swam, the crypt seeming to pulse around them. Then a voice, Reno's voice, soft and insidious, echoing from nowhere and everywhere. "You seek answers, but you'll find only darkness. The harvest is coming and you cannot stop it." The hum stopped, the air stilling, but the chill remained. Watson's hands shook as he lowered his revolver, his mind reeling. Holmes's face was a mask of determination, but his eyes burned with a fire Watson had rarely seen. "He's toying with us," Holmes said, "but every game has rules, and we will find them." They left the crypt, the weight of what they'd seen pressing down on them. Outside, the fog had thickened, the village barely visible through its gray shroud. As they stepped into the churchyard, Watson noticed something. A faint trail of footprints, too long, too thin, leading from the crypt into the fog. They weren't human, and they weren't animal. They were something else entirely. Holmes knelt, studying the prints. "He's leading us," he said. "He wants us to follow." Miss Marple's voice was steady, but her eyes were hard. "Then we follow, Mr. Holmes, but we must be ready for what we find." The footprints led from the churchyard into the heart of the fog, their unnatural shape, elongated, claw-like, yet eerily precise, etched into the damp earth like a taunt. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. John Watson, and Miss Jane Marple followed the trail, their steps muffled by the oppressive mist that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The village of St. Mary Mead was a ghost of itself, its cottages reduced to vague silhouettes, their windows dark as if the inhabitants had fled or barricaded themselves against the encroaching horror. The air was thick with the scent of wet soil and something sharper, metallic, like the memory of blood from the crypt. Holmes led the way, his lantern casting a feeble glow that barely penetrated the fog. His face was a mask of concentration, his eyes darting between the footprints and the surrounding gloom, as if expecting an ambush. Watson gripped his revolver, his nerves frayed by the crypt's grim revelations and Reno's disembodied voice. Miss Marple, her knitting bag clutched tightly, moved with a quiet resolve, her sharp gaze scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The trail wound through the village, past the shuttered bakery and the silent blacksmith's forge, before veering into a narrow lane bordered by gnarled trees. Their branches twisted overhead, skeletal fingers clawing at the fog, and Watson's skin prickled as he caught fleeting glimpses of shapes, indistinct, fleeting, but unmistakably wrong. "Holmes," he whispered, his voice tight. Are we sure this is wise? Following his trail feels like walking into a trap. Holmes didn't pause, his stride relentless. It is a trap, Watson, but traps reveal as much about the hunter as the prey. Reno wants us to follow, to see what he's prepared. We must oblige him, but on our terms. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. He's testing us, Mr. Holmes. Those footprints, the coin, the symbols, they're all part of his game. He wants us to doubt ourselves, to fear what we cannot understand. Holmes glanced at her, a rare flicker of approval in his eyes. Precisely, Miss Marple. Fear is his weapon, but knowledge is ours. We must uncover his purpose before he tightens the noose. The trail ended abruptly at the edge of a small, overgrown graveyard, its iron gate rusted and ajar. The footprints vanished into the soft earth, as if Reno had simply dissolved into the fog. The graveyard was ancient, its headstones weathered and tilting, some so old the names had been erased by time. A low stone mausoleum stood at the center, its door sealed with a heavy iron lock etched with the now familiar serpent and skull symbol. Holmes knelt, examining the ground. He stopped here, he said, his fingers brushing the earth where the footprints faded. But he didn't enter the mausoleum. The lock is untouched, the ground undisturbed. Watson frowned, his breath visible in the chill air. Then where did he go? People don't just vanish. Holmes's lips twitched into a grim smile. Don't they, Watson? We're dealing with something that defies ordinary logic. But even the extraordinary leaves traces. He stood, his gaze sweeping the graveyard. Search the area. Look for anything out of place. A mark, a token, anything that might indicate his next move. They spread out, their lanterns casting weak beams through the fog. Watson's heart pounded, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig making him grip his revolver tighter. The graveyard felt alive, its shadows shifting just beyond the light as if watching, waiting. He glanced at Miss Marple, who was peering at a headstone, her fingers tracing its weathered surface. Anything? He called, his voice sounding hollow in the stillness. She shook her head, but her eyes were sharp, alert. Not yet, Dr. Watson, but I feel something. A presence, like in the crypt. It's as if the air itself is holding its breath. Holmes, near the mausoleum, paused, his lantern illuminating a small blackened object half buried in the dirt. He knelt, carefully extracting it, a shard of obsidian, polished to a mirror-like sheen, etched with the same serpentine symbols. Another piece of his puzzle, he said, holding it up. The shard seemed to absorb the light, its surface unnaturally cold to the touch. This was placed here deliberately for us to find. As Holmes spoke, a low hum began, the same guttural vibration they'd heard in the crypt and the inn. It started faintly, then grew, resonating in their chests, making Watson's teeth ache. The fog thickened, swirling around them like a living thing, and the shadows in the graveyard seemed to coalesce, forming vague humanoid shapes that flickered at the edge of vision. Watson's hand tightened on his revolver, his pulse racing. Holmes, it's happening again. Miss Marple clutched her knitting bag, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. He's here, isn't he? Or something is. Holmes stood, the obsidian shard in his hand, his expression defiant. Show yourself, Reno, he called, his voice cutting through the hum like a blade. Enough of your games. The hum intensified, the air growing colder, heavier, as if the graveyard itself were pressing down on them. Then from the fog, a figure emerged, not Reno, but something else. It was tall, its form shrouded in a tattered cloak that seemed to writhe like smoke. Its face was hidden, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, twin points of fire that burned through the mist. Watson's breath caught, his revolver raised, but his hands shook, the weapon feeling useless against such a presence. Miss Marple gasped, stepping back, but Holmes held his ground, the shard glinting in his hand. What are you? He demanded, his voice steady but laced with a rare edge of uncertainty. The figure didn't speak, but the hum grew deafening, a sound that seemed to come from within their minds as much as without. Watson's vision blurred, his knees buckling as images flashed through his head. Blood-soaked fields, writhing serpents, a sky black with storm clouds. He heard Miss Marple cry out, her knitting bag falling to the ground, and saw Holmes stagger, the shard slipping from his grasp. Then as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, the hum fading into silence. The fog retreated slightly, leaving the trio shaken, their lanterns flickering weakly. Watson helped Miss Marple to her feet, her face pale but resolute. What was that?" he stammered, his voice hoarse. Holmes retrieved the shard, his face grim. "A projection, perhaps, or a manifestation. Reno is manipulating forces we don't yet understand. This shard, the coin, the symbols, they're conduits, tools for whatever he's summoning." Miss Marple's hands trembled as she picked up her bag, but her voice was firm. "He's not just killing, Mr. Holmes. He's preparing something. The harvest he spoke of, it's not just death. It's something bigger, something unholy." Holmes nodded, pocketing the shard. "We need to return to the vicarage, consult the vicar's records, and find any reference to these symbols or this graveyard. Reno is leading us, but he's also revealing himself. Every clue he leaves is a step closer to his undoing." As they left the graveyard, the fog seemed to watch them, its tendrils curling like fingers. Watson's heart pounded, the memory of those glowing eyes searing his mind. He glanced at Holmes, whose face was set in a mask of determination, and at Miss Marple, whose quiet strength belied the terror they'd all felt. The village of St. Mary Mead was no longer just a place. It was a battleground, and Reno was drawing them deeper into his web, a web spun from shadows and fear. The fog clung to St. Mary Mead like a malevolent spirit, its gray tendrils weaving through the village's narrow lanes, muffling sound and blurring sight. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. John Watson, and Miss Jane Marple retraced, their steps from the graveyard to the vicarage, their lanterns casting weak pools of light that seemed to falter against the encroaching mist. The encounter with the shadowy figure and the discovery of the obsidian shard had left them rattled, though Holmes's stride remained purposeful, his mind racing to piece together the fragments of Reno's puzzle. Watson's grip on his revolver was tight, his nerves frayed by the glowing eyes and the unearthly hum that still echoed in his skull. Miss Marple, her knitting bag once again slung over her shoulder, moved with a quiet resolve, but her eyes darted to every shadow, as if expecting the figure to reappear. The vicarage loomed ahead, its stone walls barely visible through the fog. The garlic wreaths on the door seemed to sag, their potency fading, and Watson couldn't shake the feeling that the village was shrinking, as if the fog were swallowing it piece by piece. Inside, Mr. Clements awaited them, his face paler than before, his hands wringing a tattered handkerchief. The parlor was unchanged, but the air felt heavier, the fire's warmth unable to dispel the chill that had settled in their bones. "Mr. Clements," Holmes began, wasting no time, "we need access to your records, any documents, parish registers, or local histories that mention this village, its graveyard, or anything resembling the symbols we found. Time is of the essence." The vicar nodded, his eyes wide with fear. I'll fetch them. There's an archive in the church, old books and papers going back centuries. But Mr. Holmes, after what you saw, do you think it's safe?" Holmes's gaze was steely. "Safety is a luxury we cannot afford. Reno is moving quickly, and we must keep pace." As Clements hurried to the church, Watson sank into a chair, his hands still trembling. "Holmes, that thing in the graveyard, it wasn't human? Those eyes, that hum. It's like nothing I've ever faced. Are we dealing with a man or something else entirely?" Miss Marple, seated across from him, resumed her knitting, though her needles moved slower than usual. "Dr. Watson, I've seen many dark things in St. Mary Mead. Greed, betrayal, murder. But this feels different. It's as if Reno is a doorway to something ancient, something that's been waiting." Holmes paced the room, the obsidian shard in his gloved hand. "He's more than a man. That much is clear. The symbols, the coin, the shard, they're not mere trinkets. They're artifacts tied to a ritual or a power we don't yet understand. His harvest is no metaphor. It's a purpose, and we're part of it, whether we choose to be or not." Clements returned, his arms laden with dusty tomes and yellowed parchments. He spread them on the table, his hands shaking as he pointed to a leather-bound volume. This is the oldest, parish records from the 14th century. There are others, local legends, accounts of strange happenings. I've never paid them much. Mine, but now... Holmes seized the volume, his fingers flipping through the brittle pages with practiced precision. His eyes scanned the faded script, pausing on a passage written in a spidery hand. "Here," he said, his voice low. Record from 1348 during the Black Death. The village was spared the worst of the plague, but not without cost. A stranger came to St. Mary Mead, described as tall and pale, with eyes that burned like fire. He offered protection, but at a price, a tithe of souls to be harvested in the shadow of the old stones. Watson's blood ran cold. A tithe of souls? That sounds like... Sacrifice, Miss Marple finished, her voice steady but grim. The villagers gave him something, or someone, to save themselves. And now Reno's here, with the same symbols, the same talk of a harvest. Holmes turned another page, revealing a crude drawing of a serpent coiled around a skull, identical to the symbols they'd found. Below it was a warning. Beware the one who walks with shadows, for he is the herald of the old ones, and his hunger knows no end. The old ones, Watson repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Holmes, this is madness. You can't seriously believe... I believe in evidence, Holmes snapped, his eyes blazing. And the evidence is mounting. Reno is connected to something ancient, something that thrives on death and fear. This shard, he held up the obsidian piece, and the coin are keys to his ritual. We need to know what he's summoning, and how to stop it. As they pored over the records, the fire flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to twist into serpentine shapes. Watson's heart pounded, his mind struggling to reconcile the rationale with the horror unfolding before them. Miss Marple's needles clicked, a steady rhythm against the growing tension, but her eyes were fixed on the window where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. A sudden noise, a low, guttural hum, broke the silence, the same sound that had haunted them in the crypt and graveyard. The air grew colder, the shadows deepening, and Watson's hand flew to his revolver. He's here, he said, his voice tight. Holmes stood, the shard in one hand, his other hand on his own weapon. Stay alert, he said, his gaze sweeping the room. He's close. The hum grew louder, vibrating in their chests, and the windows rattled as if something were trying to force its way in. Clements whimpered, clutching a crucifix, while Miss Marple's needles stopped, her hands trembling. Then a voice, Reno's voice, soft and insidious, seemed to come from the walls themselves. You dig through the past, but the future is mine. The harvest is nigh, and you will feed it. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows coalescing into the vague, towering figure at the edge of the firelight. Its eyes glowed, twin points of fire that burned through the fog, and Watson's vision blurred, his mind flooded with images of blood and serpents, of a sky torn open by darkness. He staggered, his revolver slipping from his grasp, while Miss Marple gasped, her knitting falling to the floor. Holmes, however, stood firm, holding the shard aloft. Enough, he shouted, his voice cutting through the hum like a blade. Show yourself, Reno, or whatever you are. The figure vanished, the hum fading, but the air remained heavy, charged with an unseen presence. Watson retrieved his revolver, his hands shaking, while Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her face pale, but resolute. Clements was sobbing quietly, his crucifix clutched to his chest. He's playing with us, Holmes said, his voice grim. But every move he makes reveals more. These records, the shard, the symbols, they're pieces of a larger design. We need to find the old stones mentioned in the text. They may hold the key to his ritual. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes hard. There's a stone circle just beyond the village. It's ancient, older than the church. The villagers avoid it, say it's cursed. I never paid it much mind, but now... Holmes's gaze sharpened. Then that's our next destination. But we must be cautious. Reno is watching, and he's growing bolder. As they prepared to leave, Watson noticed something on the table. A fresh mark, scratched into the wood. A serpent, coiled around a skull. It hadn't been there before. His heart sank, the realization hitting him that Reno had been in the room, or something had, leaving its mark as a taunt. The fog outside pulsed, as if alive, and Watson felt the weight of an unseen gaze, watching, waiting, drawing them deeper into a nightmare that threatened to consume them all. The fog over St. Mary Mead had thickened into a near impenetrable shroud, its gray tendrils curling like spectral fingers around the village's edges, as if guarding the secrets buried within. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. John Watson, and Miss Jane Marple set out from the vicarage, their lanterns barely piercing the oppressive mist, as they headed toward the ancient stone circle mentioned in the parish records. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and a faint, metallic tang that set Watson's nerves on edge, a reminder of the blood and horror they'd encountered in the crypt. Holmes led the way, his long coat blending into the fog, his eyes, sharp and unyielding, clutching the obsidian shard as if it were a talisman against the darkness. Watson's revolver was a cold weight in his hand, its presence a fragile anchor to reality, while Miss Marple, her knitting bag slung over her shoulder, moved with a quiet determination that belied the terror gnawing at them all. The path to the stone circle wound through a dense copse of trees, their gnarled branches twisting overhead like skeletal hands clawing at the sky. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional, eerie caw of a crow hidden in the fog. Watson's heart pounded, his senses heightened by the memory of Reno's voice and the glowing eyes of the shadowy figure in the graveyard. "Holmes," he whispered, his voice barely carrying. "This feels like we're walking into his lair. Are we sure this is wise?" Holmes didn't break stride, his lantern casting flickering shadows on the trees. "Wisdom is secondary to necessity, Watson. The stone circle is the heart of this mystery. Reno's symbols, his harvest, the records, they all point here. If we're to stop him, we must face him on his ground." Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm, her eyes scanning the darkness. "He's leading us, Mr. Holmes, just as he led us to the graveyard. But every step we take, we learn more. He's not infallible. He leaves clues, whether he means to or not." Holmes glanced at her, a rare spark of respect in his eyes. "Indeed. Miss Marple, his arrogance is his weakness. He wants us to see his power, to fear it. But fear is a distraction, and we will not be distracted." The path opened into a clearing, and the stone circle loomed before them, its massive, weathered stones arranged in a rough oval, half swallowed by the fog. The stones were ancient, their surfaces pitted and etched with faint, spiraling symbols that matched those on the coin, the shard, and Reno's cane. The air here was colder, heavier, as if the circle were a void drawing the warmth from the world. Watson's breath caught, his skin prickling as he noticed the ground within the circle, blackened as if scorched, with no grass or weeds daring to grow. Holmes stepped forward, his lantern raised, examining the nearest stone. "These carvings," he said, his voice low, "are older than the village, older than the church. They predate any known civilization in Britain. The symbols suggest a ritual, a binding, or an offering." Watson's stomach churned. "An offering? You mean like the tithe of souls in the records?" "Precisely," Holmes said, his fingers tracing the carvings. "The stone circle is a focal point, a place of power. Reno's actions, the murders, the symbols, the artifacts, are building toward something here. His harvest is no mere metaphor. It's a culmination." Miss Marple knelt by the edge of the circle, her fingers brushing the blackened earth. "There's something wrong with this place," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've felt unease in St. Mary Mead before, but it's as if the ground itself is tainted." As she spoke, a low hum began, the same guttural vibration that had haunted them in the crypt, the graveyard, and the vicarage. It started faintly, then grew, resonating in their bones, making Watson's teeth ache. The fog swirled faster, the shadows within the circle deepening, and Watson's hand tightened on his revolver, his pulse racing. "He's here," he said, his voice hoarse. Holmes spun, his lantern casting wild beams through the fog. "Stay together," he ordered, his voice sharp. "He's trying to unnerve us." The hum intensified, and the air grew colder, the stone seeming to pulse with a faint, unnatural light. Watson's vision blurred, his mind flooded with fleeting images, blood pooling on stone, serpents coiling in darkness, a figure with burning eyes standing at the circle's center. He staggered, his revolver shaking in his hand, while Miss Marple clutched her knitting bag, her lips moving in silent prayer. Then, from the fog, Reno emerged, not as a shadowy projection, but in the flesh, his tall, gaunt figure unmistakable. His long coat seemed to writhe like a living thing, and his eyes burned with that same unnatural fire, piercing the mist. His silver cane tapped the ground, the serpent and skull handle glinting, and his smile was a predator's, sharp and merciless. "Welcome," Reno said, his voice smooth and cold like ice sliding over stone. "You've followed my trail just as I knew you would. The circle is ready and so are you." Holmes stepped forward, the obsidian shard in his hand, his voice steady despite the hum's oppressive weight. "What are you, Reno? What is this harvest you speak of?" Reno's smile widened, his teeth glinting. "I am the herald, Holmes. The old ones stir, and the world must feed them. The circle is their altar, and your souls, your fear, your defiance will open the way." Watson's heart pounded, his mind reeling. "Old ones, you're mad." Reno's eyes locked onto him, and Watson felt as if his soul were being laid bare, his fears exposed. "Madness is seeing only what you're told to see, Doctor. The truth is older than your world, hungrier than your nightmares. You've seen the signs, the coin, the shard, the blood. You feel the truth even if you deny it." Miss Marple stepped forward, her small frame radiating defiance. "You're not invincible, Mr. Reno. You leave clues, marks, artifacts. You want us to know, to fear, but fear can be overcome." Reno's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment his smile faltered, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Clever, Miss Marple, but you're too late. The circle is awake and the harvest begins tonight." Before Holmes could respond, Reno raised his cane, and the hum became a deafening roar. The stones glowed brighter, their symbols pulsing like heartbeats, and the fog coalesced into writhing shapes. Serpents, skulls, figures with glowing eyes. Watson fired his revolver, the shot swallowed by the fog, useless against the spectral forms. Miss Marple clutched her bag, pulling out a small crucifix, her voice rising in a prayer that seemed to falter against the hum's power. Holmes, undaunted, hurled the obsidian shard into the circle's center, where it struck the blackened earth with a sound like shattering glass. The hum faltered, the shapes dissolving, and Reno staggered, his eyes blazing with fury. "You dare!" he hissed, his voice no longer smooth but raw, guttural, as if something else spoke through him. The fog retreated, the stones dimming, and Reno vanished, his cane's tap echoing into the distance. Watson's knees buckled, his revolver falling to the ground while Miss Marple leaned against a stone, her breath ragged. Holmes retrieved the shard, now cracked but still cold, his face grim. "He's weakened," Holmes said, his voice steady, but strained. "The shard disrupted his ritual, but only temporarily. We've bought time, nothing more." Watson's voice trembled. "What was that, Holmes? Those shapes? That power? It's not human." Holmes's eyes burned with determination. "It's not, Watson. But it's bound by rules, by artifacts like this shard. We need to find the source of his power, the coin, the cane, the circle itself, and destroy it." Miss Marple nodded, her face pale but resolute. "The village is next. He'll strike again to feed his harvest. We must protect the people, and we must act before nightfall." As they left the circle, the fog seemed to watch them, its tendrils curling like a warning. Watson's heart raced, the memory of Reno's eyes and the writhing shapes searing his mind. The stone circle was no mere relic. It was a gateway, and Reno was its keeper, drawing them deeper into a horror that threatened to unravel reality itself. The fog over St. Mary Mead had become a living entity, its gray tendrils slithering through the village like the coils of some vast, unseen serpent. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. John Watson, and Miss Jane Marple hurried back from the stone circle, their lanterns flickering as the mist seemed to press closer, as if reluctant to let them escape. The confrontation with Reno had left them shaken. His words about the old ones and the harvest echoed in their minds, and the cracked obsidian shard in Holmes's pocket felt like a ticking bomb, its cold weight a constant reminder of the unnatural forces at play. Watson's hand never strayed far from his revolver, though he doubted its efficacy against the writhing shapes they'd seen. Miss Marple, her knitting bag clutched tightly, murmured prayers under her breath, her eyes scanning the fog for any sign of Reno's return. The village was a ghost town, its streets empty, its cottages sealed tight against the encroaching darkness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and that ever-present metallic tang, now laced with something sour, like fear itself. As they approached the Blue Boar Inn, their temporary base, a faint light glowed from its windows, but it was wrong, too red, too unsteady, like the pulse of a dying heart. Holmes paused, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied the inn's facade. "He's been here," he said, his voice low. "The air feels disturbed." Watson's heart pounded, his grip tightening on his revolver. "You think he's inside, Missy?" Marple's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "He's everywhere, Dr. Watson, but he's not omnipotent. He leaves traces, and those traces are our weapons." Holmes nodded, pushing open the inn's door. The common room was deserted, the fire in the hearth reduced to embers, casting long shadows that seemed to twist into serpentine forms. The innkeeper, Tom Graves, was nowhere to be seen, but a faint smear of blood stained the counter, fresh and glistening. Watson's stomach churned, his medical instincts warring with the dread that gripped him. "Graves," he called, his voice echoing in the empty room. No answer came. Holmes moved swiftly to the counter, examining the blood. "Recent," he said, dipping a finger into the smear and sniffing it. "Not more than an hour old. And it's wrong. Too thick, almost viscous." He produced a small vial from his pocket, collecting a sample with clinical precision. Miss Marple's eyes darted to the staircase where the scratches they'd noticed before, near Reno's room, seemed deeper, more pronounced. "He's been busy," she said, her voice low. "He knows we're closing in and he's escalating." Holmes led the way upstairs, his lantern illuminating the narrow hallway. The door to Reno's room was ajar, a faint glow emanating from within. Not lamplight, but something colder, more unnatural, like moonlight reflected through ice. Watson's pulse quickened, his revolver raised, while Miss Marple clutched her crucifix, her lips moving silently. Holmes pushed the door open, revealing a scene that froze them in their tracks. The room was transformed. The sparse furnishings were gone, replaced by a circle of candles, their flames burning an eerie blue. At the center stood a small altar, crudely fashioned from blackened wood, adorned with symbols, serpents coiling around skulls etched in what looked like dried blood. The obsidian shard symbols pulsed faintly, as if in response, and the air was thick with the same burnt herb scent they'd encountered before, now mingled with something rancid, like rotting flesh. On the altar lay a small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and brittle, and beside it a silver chalice filled with a dark, viscous liquid that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. Watson's breath caught, his revolver trembling in his hand. "Holmes, what is this?" Holmes stepped forward, his face a mask of grim determination. "A shrine," he said, his voice steady but laced with tension. "Or a focus for his ritual. The book, the chalice, they're part of his harvest." Miss Marple approached the altar, her eyes narrowing as she studied the book. "It's old," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Older than the parish records and the writing. It's like the symbols we've seen, but more complex, as if it's a language meant for something not human. Holmes carefully opened the book, revealing pages filled with angular, spiraling script that seemed to shift under the light, as if resisting comprehension. "This is no ordinary text," he said. "It's a grimoire, a record of rituals tied to the old ones. The symbols match those in the stone circle and the shard. Reno is using this to channel something, power, entities, or worse." As he spoke, the candles flared, their blue flames leaping higher, and a low hum began, the same guttural vibration that had haunted them since their arrival. The air grew colder, the shadows in the room lengthening, and Watson's vision blurred. His mind, flooded with images, blood-soaked altars, writhing serpents, a sky torn open by darkness. He staggered, his revolver slipping, while Miss Marple clutched her crucifix, her prayer rising to a desperate chant. Then Reno's voice echoed, not from the room, but from within their minds, smooth and insidious. "You're too late, Holmes. The circle is complete, the altar prepared. The harvest begins, and your souls will light the way." The hum intensified, the candles flaring until the room was bathed in blue light, and the shadows coalesced into a towering figure. Not Reno, but the same spectral form they'd seen in the graveyard, its glowing eyes burning through the fog. Watson fired his revolver, the shots swallowed by the hum, useless against the figure's intangible form. Miss Marple raised her crucifix, her voice steady despite her trembling hands, but the figure only laughed, a sound like shattering glass. Holmes seized the chalice, hurling its contents onto the altar. The liquid hissed, the symbols on the wood sizzling as if burned, and the figure screamed, a sound that tore through their minds like a blade. The hum faltered, the candles flickering out, and the figure dissolved, leaving only darkness and silence. Watson's knees buckled, his revolver clattering to the floor. "Holmes, what was that?" Holmes's face was pale, but his eyes burned with defiance. "A projection of his power tied to this altar. We've disrupted it, but only for now. The book, the chalice, they're anchors for his ritual. We need to destroy them." Miss Marple retrieved the book, her hands steady despite the horror. "We can't do it here," she said. "The village is too close, too vulnerable. We need to take these to the stone circle, where his power is strongest. If we're to stop him, it must be there." Holmes nodded, pocketing the book and the cracked shard. "Agreed, but we must move quickly. Reno will know we've struck at his altar, and he'll retaliate." As they left the room, the fog outside pulsed, as if alive, and Watson noticed a fresh mark on the door, a serpent coiled around a skull scratched deeper than before, still wet with blood. His heart sank, the realization hitting him that Reno was always one step ahead, watching, waiting. The inn was no longer a refuge. It was a trap, and the village was a battleground, drawing them deeper into a nightmare where the line between reality and horror was blurring. The fog over St. Mary Mead had thickened into a suffocating veil, its gray tendrils coiling like serpents, as if the village itself were being strangled by the unseen forces Reno had unleashed. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. John Watson, and Miss Jane Marple moved swiftly through the mist, their lanterns barely cutting through the oppressive darkness as they headed back to the ancient stone circle. The leather-bound grimoire, its pages heavy with alien script, was tucked under Holmes's arm, while the cracked obsidian shard weighed heavily in his pocket. Watson's revolver was a cold comfort in his hand, his heart pounding with the memory of the spectral figure in the inn and the blood-soaked altar. Miss Marple, her knitting bag slung over her shoulder, clutched her crucifix, her lips moving in silent prayer, though her eyes burned with a resolve that matched Holmes's own. The path to the stone circle was treacherous, the ground slick with damp and littered with twisted roots that seemed to writhe in the fog. The air was thick with the scent of decay, now mingled with a sharp ozone-like tang, as if a storm were brewing within the mist. The village was silent, its cottages mere shadows, their windows dark and lifeless. Watson's nerves were raw, every rustle in the fog making him grip his revolver tighter. "Holmes," he whispered, his voice barely carrying. "This feels like the endgame. He's drawing us to the circle, isn't he?" Holmes's stride was relentless, his lantern casting eerie beams that danced on the gnarled trees. "He is, Watson. The stone circle is his altar, the heart of his ritual. The grimoire, the shard, the symbols, they're all converging here. He wants us to witness his harvest, to feed it with our fear or our defiance." Miss Marple's voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "He underestimates us, Mr. Holmes. He thinks we'll break, but we've faced darkness before. We must use his arrogance against him." Holmes glanced at her, a rare flicker of admiration. His eyes. "Well said, Miss Marple. He's revealed too much. His shrine, his book, his symbols. Every step he takes exposes his weaknesses. We must strike now before the ritual is complete." The stone circle loomed ahead, its massive stones glowing faintly with an unnatural light, their serpentine symbols pulsing like heartbeats. The blackened earth at the circle's center seemed to drink in the fog, creating a void that made Watson's skin crawl. The air was colder here, heavier, as if the circle were a wound. The world, bleeding something ancient and malign. Holmes paused at the edge, his lantern raised, studying the ground. "The footprints are fresh," he said, pointing to the elongated claw-like marks they'd seen before. "He's been here, and recently." Watson's heart raced, his eyes scanning the fog for any sign of Reno. "What's our plan, Holmes? We can't just walk in and hope to outwit him." Holmes opened the grimoire, its pages rustling as if alive. "The book is the key," he said. "Its rituals are tied to the circle, to the old ones he serves. If we destroy it, we disrupt his power. But we must be precise. Any mistake could amplify the ritual instead." Miss Marple knelt by a stone, her fingers tracing its carvings. "These symbols," she said, her voice low, "they're not just decoration. They're a language, a call. I've seen similar patterns in old village tales, stories of sacrifices to keep the darkness at bay." As she spoke, a low hum began, the same guttural vibration that had haunted them since their arrival. It started faintly, then grew, resonating in their chests, making Watson's vision blur. The fog swirled faster, the stones glowing brighter, and shadows began to coalesce at the circle's center. Writhing shapes, serpents, skulls, figures with glowing eyes. Watson raised his revolver, his hands shaking while Miss Marple clutched her crucifix, her prayer rising to a desperate chant. Then Reno appeared, stepping from the fog like a specter made flesh. His tall, gaunt figure was unmistakable, his long coat seeming to merge with the mist, his eyes burning with an unnatural fire. His silver cane tapped the ground, its serpent and skull handle glinting, and his smile was a predator's, sharp and merciless. "You've brought my book," he said, his voice smooth and cold, echoing in their minds. "Good. The circle hungers, and your souls will complete the offering." Holmes stepped forward, the grimoire in one hand, the shard in the other, his voice steady despite the hum's oppressive weight. "Your ritual ends here, Reno. You've overplayed your hand." Reno's smile widened, his teeth glinting. "You think you can stop the old ones? They are older than your world, hungrier than your fears. The harvest is inevitable, and you are its final piece." The hum intensified, the stones pulsing with light, and the shadows at the circle's center solidified into a towering figure. Not Reno, but something else, something vast and formless, its eyes twin voids that seemed to swallow the light. Watson's knees buckled, his revolver useless against the entity's presence, while Miss Marple's prayer faltered, her crucifix glowing faintly as if struggling against the darkness. Holmes, undaunted, hurled the grimoire into the circle's center, where it landed on the blackened earth with a sound like thunder. The symbols on the stones flared, the hum becoming a deafening roar, and the figure screamed, a sound that tore through their minds like a blade. Watson fired his revolver, the shot swallowed by the chaos, while Miss Marple raised her crucifix, her voice rising in defiance. Holmes seized the shard, driving it into the grimoire's pages. The book burst into flames, its symbols writhing as if alive, and the figure shrieked, its form unraveling into tendrils of shadow that lashed at the fog. Reno staggered, his eyes blazing with fury, his cane raised as if to strike. "You fools!" he hissed, his voice no longer smooth but raw, guttural. "You've only delayed the inevitable." The stones dimmed, the hum faltering, and the figure dissolved, leaving only Reno, his form trembling as if his power were draining. Holmes lunged, tackling him to the ground, the shard still clutched in his hand. Watson rushed forward, his revolver trained on Reno, while Miss Marple stood over them, her crucifix raised like a beacon. "You're finished," Holmes said, his voice cold as steel. "Your ritual is broken, your altar destroyed." Reno's eyes burned, but his smile was gone, replaced by a snarl. "You think this ends with me? The old ones see you now. They know your names." Before Holmes could respond, Reno's body convulsed, his form dissolving into a cloud of black mist that merged with the fog, leaving only his cane, its handle cracked and lifeless. The hum ceased, the stones falling dark, and the fog retreated, revealing the village once more. Watson's breath came in ragged gasps, his revolver falling to his side. Is it over?" Holmes stood, the shard and cane in his hands, his face grim. "For now, Watson." But Reno's words were a warning. The old ones are not so easily dismissed. Miss Marple lowered her crucifix, her face pale but resolute. "We've stopped the harvest, but the village will never be the same. We must warn the others, protect them from what may come." As they left the circle, the fog lingered, watching, waiting. Watson's heart still raced, the memory of those void-like eyes searing his mind. The stone circle was silent, but its power lingered, a reminder that the horror they'd faced was only the beginning. The fog over St. Mary Mead had retreated, but its shadow lingered, a faint haze that clung to the village like a memory of the horror that had unfolded. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. John Watson, and Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of the stone circle, the air still heavy with the scent of scorched earth and the faint metallic tang of blood. The cracked obsidian shard and Reno's broken cane lay in Holmes's hands, their once potent symbols now dull, as if drained of power. The grimoire's ashes smoldered at the circle's center, a blackened scar on the ground where the ritual had been disrupted. Yet the silence was not comforting. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the fighting, charged with the weight of what had been and what might still come. Watson's hands trembled as he holstered his revolver, his mind reeling from the confrontation with Reno and the spectral entity that had nearly overwhelmed them. His breath came in shallow gasps, the memory of those void-like eyes and the writhing shadows haunting him. "Holmes," he said, his voice hoarse, "is it truly over? Reno's gone, but his words, the old ones know us now." Holmes's face was grim, his eyes scanning the stone circle as if expecting the fog to coalesce once more. "For now, Watson, we've stopped him. The grimoire's destruction and the shard's disruption broke his ritual. But Reno, or whatever he was, spoke the truth. We've drawn the attention of something ancient, something that does not forget." Miss Marple, her knitting bag once again slung over her shoulder, held her crucifix tightly, her face pale but resolute. "The village will never be the same," she said softly. "The people here felt the darkness even if they didn't see it. They'll need guidance, protection, to keep this from rising again." Holmes nodded, pocketing the shard and cane. "We'll return to the vicarage, inform Mr. Clements, and ensure the village is safeguarded. The parish records must be secured, and the stone circle sealed, perhaps destroyed. But first we need to understand what we've faced." They made their way back to the vicarage, the fog parting reluctantly before them. The village was stirring now, faint lights flickering in cottage windows, as if the inhabitants sensed the immediate danger had passed. Yet the air remained heavy, the silence oppressive, and Watson couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if the fog itself were an extension of the old one's gaze. At the vicarage, Mr. Clements awaited them, his face a mask of relief and fear. The parlor was as they'd left it, the fire low, the dusty tomes still scattered on the table. Holmes placed the shard and cane beside the remaining parish records, his fingers lingering on the cracked handle. "These artifacts," he said, "are remnants of a power we've only begun to comprehend. The symbols, the rituals, they're tied to entities that exist beyond our understanding of time and space." Watson sank into a chair, his hands still shaking. "Holmes, you're talking about things that sound like madness. Entities? Old ones? We're men of science, of reason. How do we fight something we can't even name?" Holmes's eyes burned with a fierce intensity. "We fight with knowledge, Watson. Reason is our weapon, even against the unknown. Reno was a conduit, a herald, but he was not invincible. We broke his ritual, and we can break whatever follows." Miss Marple, seated across from them, resumed her knitting, the click of her needles a grounding rhythm in the tense room. "In St. Mary Mead, I've learned that evil often hides in plain sight. Greed, envy, betrayal. This was different, but not so different that it cannot be faced. We've seen his tools, his symbols. We know his weaknesses." Clements, still clutching his crucifix, spoke up, his voice trembling. "What do we do now? The village, the people, they're terrified. They whisper of curses, of demons." Holmes's voice was firm. "You'll tell them the truth, or as much of it as they can bear. A dangerous man came to St. Mary Mead, and he's been stopped. The stone circle must be avoided, perhaps filled in, and the church must keep watch for any signs of disturbance. The records will stay with you, but they must be locked away, studied only by those who understand the danger." Miss Marple nodded. "I'll stay in the village, Mr. Holmes. The people trust me, and I can guide them, help them heal. But you and Dr. Watson, you'll carry this with you, won't you?" Holmes's expression softened, a rare moment of vulnerability. "We will, Miss Marple, but we've faced darkness before and we'll face it again if we must." As they spoke, a faint hum sounded, so low it was almost imperceptible, like a whisper from the fog. Watson's heart skipped, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver, but Holmes raised a hand, his eyes narrowing. "It's not Reno," he said. "Not yet. But it's a reminder. We've won a battle, not the war." They spent the rest of the night organizing the records, cataloging the symbols and planning safeguards for the village. Holmes sketched the serpent and skull markings, committing them to memory, while Watson bandaged his own nerves with a stiff brandy from Clements's meager stores. Miss Marple knitted, her needles a steady counterpoint to the lingering dread, her eyes sharp and watchful. By dawn, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing a village battered but alive. The trio stepped outside, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the haze, casting long shadows that seemed to retreat reluctantly. Watson felt a flicker of hope, though it was tempered by the weight of Reno's final words. "Holmes," he said, "what if they come for us, the old ones, or whatever they are?" Holmes's gaze was distant, fixed on the horizon. "Then we'll be ready, Watson. We've faced the impossible before, and we'll do it again. For now, we return to London, but we carry the knowledge of this place with us." Miss Marple paused at the vicarage gate, her face resolute. "I'll stay, as I said. St. Mary Mead is my home, and I'll protect it. But if you ever need me, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you know where to find me." Holmes bowed slightly, a rare gesture of respect. "You're a formidable ally, Miss Marple. Should the shadows return, we'll call on you." As they boarded the train back to London, Watson looked back at the village, its spire fading into the lingering fog. The memory of Reno's eyes, the writhing shapes. They would haunt him, he knew, but so would the strength of his companions. The battle was over, but the war, as Holmes had said, was far from won.